Big Nambas, or Thunintaut, as it's known to its natives, is a language spoken by an estimated 3,300 people in villages lying to the north of the island Malakula, the second largest island of Vanuatu in the Western Pacific. Big Nambas is part of the Oceanic branch of the Austronesian language family, thus making it related to languages such as Malay, Tagalog and Maori. Most of its vocabulary is Austronesian, although there are also loanwords from other languages, including English. Anthropologist John Layard may have studied the Big Nambas people during his 1914 expedition to Malakula, although the primary source for the language is Dr. G.J. Fox's Big Nambas Grammar, which he published in 1979. I found this work very interesting to read and fairly approachable, so I've left a link in the description box below. Most of the content of this video is based on that paper, although I have tried to mix in other scraps I could find about the language. Big Nambas has a total of 19 phonemes, 14 consonants and 5 vowels. It features a series of linguolabial consonants, which are rare sounds produced with the tongue against the upper lip. It also uses one voiced stop, which is prenasalized. The consonant phonemes are m, n, n, p, p, t, k, d, v, v, s, r, l, r. Aside from S, all fricatives have voiceless allophones word initially and finally, but are voiced medially. The voiceless stops all have aspirated allophones word finally, except for the linguolabial. L can be voiceless word finally and next to T, and can appear as a voiced lateral fricative next to N. The vowels are E, U, E, and A. E and U become E and U in closed syllables, and A becomes A in closed unstressed syllables, and R next to labials, velars, and in the unstressed form of the ow diphthong. The R and U vowels and consonants T, L, N, R, and V are able to geminate in between syllables. Additionally, there are a number of vowel changes which occur in certain morphological environments. Big Nambas is notable for its consonant clustering. It has a moderate syllable structure, which allows syllables made up of only consonants, allowing words such as itunten. Clusters of up to 4 vowels are also permitted, as in the word naue. Stress is phonemic and usually falls on the penult, although it stays fixed when the word is inflected. Most sounds are written the same as their IPA, although the linguolabial sounds are written as their bilabial equivalents with the following apostrophe. The velar fricative is written with H, and the prenasalized stop is written just as D. The schwa is occasionally written as an E diaeresis. Between N and R, an epenthetic D is added. This may be written NR or DR, depending on the grammatical interpretation required by the context. Big Nambas nouns are divided into 2 main classes, obligatorily possessed and optionally possessed. As the names suggest, these classes are based on whether they have to be possessed in a sentence, or whether they can also stand on their own without possession. Most nouns are optionally possessed, but many words for parts of other things and family members are obligatorily possessed, as well as ordinal numbers. Obligatorily possessed nouns either take the possessive suffixes or use juxtaposition to show possession. For the latter, the possessor comes second. The possessive suffixes are derived from the personal pronouns, of which there are 7. There is a slightly different set for obligatorily possessed and optionally possessed nouns. For some optionally possessed nouns, there is a special possessive preposition, na, which takes the suffixes instead of the noun itself. In the third person, for some select nouns, the stem changes to ne. The names of people and family members are optionally possessed. These nouns require a special particle a in all cases, except when they're being addressed directly. Big Nambas nouns, as you may have seen in the examples, are not marked for number. This means that the phrase apupun could mean his grandfather or his grandfathers. Generally though, context and the number of the possessor help suggest which meaning is appropriate. Compound nouns are formed from a noun stem followed by a modifying verbal stem. For instance, the words fire and to scrape can be combined to create the word for match. Big Nambas adjectives are placed after their nouns. They can be used predicatively as stative verbs and can be possessed instead of the noun via the possessive suffixes. There is a class of adjectives which are by Fox called denotative and correspond to English demonstratives. They are non-verbal and unpossessable. Prepositions can either be suffixed or unaffixed. Those which are suffixed can take possessive suffixes or direct object suffixes. This depends on which possession is being used, with some taking the direct object suffixes and some taking possessive suffixes, but never both. Some prepositions have different stems for their suffixed and unsuffixed forms. We've already encountered one such preposition, na or ne, which is used with the nan and nen possessed nouns. This functions the same as asan and sana. Verbs are a very important part of the language. Most adjectives and numerals are classed as verbs. There are two verbal classes, simply called Class 1 and Class 2, which differ by inflection pattern. Class 2 contains only a small number of intransitive verbs, but Class 1 contains many more, both transitive and intransitive verbs. There are 10 slots for affixes. Verbs rarely occur with all slots filled, usually instead just taking the mode and number marking. Given this and the short morphemes, verbs usually aren't very long, despite their agglutinativity and being the most complex part of the language. The first main affix I'm going to discuss is the person-mode prefix. This is a fusional affix which codes for the person of the subject and the mode of the verb. The realis mode is used for past or present real actions. It can be used with all other verbal affixes and its marking is the same between both classes of verbs. It doesn't show plurality except in the third person, which marks singular and non-singular. The singular can also be used with plural subjects to group them together as a collective. The irrealis is primarily used to convey the future tense. It's compatible with the number and proximity prefixes. It codes for all three persons in the singular, the third person non-singular, and the first person plain and restrictive plurals. It varies only in the first person singular between the two classes. The irrealis condition is the term given by Fox for the mood which is about equivalent to the subjunctive and conditional moods in European languages. There's quite a bit of variation between the two classes here. Beside the third person, Class 1 doesn't have plural forms. Class 2 also has an indefinite plural form in the third person, equivalent to the plural of English one or German man. The final mode is the imperative, which is used for commands. There are three different strategies for marking the imperative. The first is a prefix, which has slightly different forms for the two classes. The second strategy also varies between them, as well as having different singular and plural forms. The Class 2 plural for this strategy also requires the plural prefix. The third strategy is simply use of the second person irrealis form, but with addition of a special intonation and stress pattern, effectively conveying the meaning, "you will do it." The second affix after mode is the necessity prefix. This translates into English with the meaning must. It's used with the realis form of the verb. Before this prefix, the second person marker allophonically becomes m instead of k. When positive, the verb is usually followed by a necessity particle, but this doesn't appear in the negative. Next are the aspect markers. There are three aspects in Big Nambas: the completive, the continuative, and the proximal. The completive and continuative can only be used in the realis or irrealis condition modes, and the proximal only in the realis and irrealis. Only the continuative can be negated. The completive shows a completed action and usually has a following particle. The continuative denotes an action which is still happening in the positive and one which hasn't yet happened in the negative. The proximal indicates a closeness in time, either in the past or in the future, so may be called a recent past or near future. The negative morpheme comes next. It varies only in class 2 singulars. The irrealis cannot occur with the negative morpheme. In order to convey this meaning, the realis is used with the necessity affix and the negative morpheme. There are 4 types of number marker. The singular is unmarked for both classes. The restricted plural denotes a small number of subjects, usually 2. The plural marking differs for the 2 classes. There is also an indefinite plural for class 2 verbs, which is the same concept as the one for the irrealis condition prefixes. The final prefix to the verb stem is the habitual aspect marker, which occurs with either negative verbs or a duplicated class 1 verbs. It always occurs in the same form, except for in the 2 class 2 verbs, ma and va. The first possible verbal suffix set is the stem modifiers. These affect the meaning of the verb and can change the valency. There are quite a few of these, but a sample are shown on the screen. The next suffixes are the ability suffixes. There are 2 of these, having the meanings of to know how to and to be physically able to. Both classes of verb take the same suffixes here. There are 3 pronominal object suffixes, which come finally. All non-pronominal objects are simply placed after the verb. There is also a set of benefactive suffixes, identical to the optional possessive markers. They are used with intransitive verbs to denote who the verb is done for. The last group of affixes to verbs is the set of prefixes, which turn verbs into dependent verbs. A dependent verb is one which depends on another verb, and shows progression of events or simultaneity. For instance, in the sentence, he became frightened and ran away is dependent. In this example, it takes the prefix ka, which translates to and. Dependent verbs can only take aspect and number prefixes, which means they don't always carry as full a range of marking as the verbs which precede them, even though the 2 have the same subject. They can, however, still take the full range of suffixes. Any verb can take dependent marking. The verb stem itself can occur in root form or as a reduplicated or compound stem. Verb stems can be reduplicated to show intensity or repetition, and some transitive roots are able to become intransitive by this method. Verbal compounds are multiple roots built into one stem. These appear one after the other with no marking in between. They differ from dependent verbs in that the 2 roots of a compound stem combine in meaning to form one, while dependent verbs keep their meanings separate. Numerals in Big Nambas act as verbs. There is only one numeral which doesn't inflect, isat. This is the form of the number 1, used only in counting. There is also a second word for 1, yamak. which is inflected and used for all other purposes. Similarly, the numeral 10 has both a counting form and an inflecting form, although in this case both use the same stem, just with different prefixes. Numerals can't take verbal suffixes or the habitual prefix, but can take all other prefixes. The numerals 2 to 5 are class 2 verbs, but all others are class 1. Big Nambas numerals are base 10. The numbers up to 10 each have their own roots, although those above 5 are made up of the corresponding number less than 5. The teen numbers make use of the particle ndaman. They follow the structure 10 plus number, where the plus is the aforementioned particle. The multiples of 10 use compound stems, made up of an altered root for 10 and the multiplier number. For numbers in between these multiples, this construction is used. The 10 comes first, inflected, then the bare stem of the 10 above, the possessive preposition, and finally the unit number. Hundreds use multiplication. They have a multiplicative prefix on the multiplier number coming after the word for hundred. The word for hundred can also mean many. Modifying adverbs modify verbs or other adverbs. They don't take any suffixes and can make objects of intransitive verbs indirect instead of direct. Locative adverbs, like here, there, and over there, can be derived from the demonstrative denotative adjectives with an adverbalizer, at. The language also contains two interrogative adverbs, which don't receive inflection and are used in questions to request locative and temporal information. Particles in Big Nambas can act in the roles of English connectives and interjections, as well as filling a range of roles not present in English. We've already encountered the so-called referential particle, which occurs before names of people, and several grammatical particles, such as those which complement verbal aspect marking. The particles ki and ra are also quite important. Ra is sometimes called the interrogative particle, as it is often used in questions with a meaning like eh? Or is that right? It can, however, also have a supportive affirmative use to strengthen a positive statement. Ki is a particle which is able to take on a range of meanings, depending on the intonation it's given. There are also particles to introduce relative or subordinate clauses, and to perform other sentence joining functions. Since a lot of Big Nambas' grammar revolves around verbs, so too does the syntax. The simplest sentence is composed only of an inflected verb. If a non-pronominal subject is used, this can be placed before the verb. An object can likewise be placed after. In clauses where to be is the verb in use, the equational subject follows the verb instead of preceding it. In these phrases, the verb can also sometimes be entirely removed. In questions, an interrogative word stands in for the requested information. For instance, if a subject is being requested, the interrogative comes before the verb, whereas if an object is wanted, it comes after. This matches the declarative sentence structure. Relative clauses come after the nouns they modify, and are infixed as a whole into one of a number of denotative adjectives, sometimes with a degree of reduplication as well. Relative clauses can also stand without an introducer if the meaning is unambiguous. Adverbs come after verbs, as adjectives follow nouns. They can also occur at the start of a sentence, perhaps to draw attention to them. Pua, Lupu, Naghut, Kilau, Manach, Lipach, Chop, Prapar, Numat, Plow, Put, Vli, Num, Ntrolna, Nata, Nach, Nirach, Tut, su, di, miel, was, Imat, unei, tatei, tap, pupu, penei, mrirei, vân, titiatoch, titiamu, eina, timach, nawe, nas, pai, matu, luli, naus, nugau, patilach, tret, isit, iamak, iru, itl, iva, ilan, ilimsei, isaru, isatl, isavet, sanal, inal, tavet, ndui, mlin, marndel, nat, marpu, au, elte, van maran, malakal, ivi, irp, ilil, iverver, ila, iruch, indunduvach, igai, igapil, iver, ilak, ima, iva, ima, irs, iu, irer, ivan, inev, iuth. Paia kinelru neltl nenitl. Nru veti pepervrati. Ivasen nutapitar. Pelakasen mi, ra. Karnamer. Kilava ivinakak. Nummer kitaraweti. Hinamaiti ipasi la plet ligaten dika. Pavla klei wamatlara. Numatlam iman dika iwaskamat. Atkanu iuyesh. Lupua vlich ndaumau. Au imakarpan sarian. Mat katane. Kakausamani. Ila pasa kane. Nami imami metavla nakbeh. Akitu na vetaner.